After 42 hours overtime, the Iran nuclear negotiations with the United States, Russia, China, France, Great Britain, and Germany reached a framework deal in Lausanne, Switzerland. In return for lifting the sanctions on Iran, which means more than $110 billion a year relief for Tehran and a return to the global economy, in exchange for this, Iran will be significantly constrained in its nuclear program. Now, this is a framework agreement, meaning the official deal will be signed before July 1st. Over the next 3 months, the technical details will have to be worked out. So what does the Iran nuclear deal really mean? My name is Shirvan and welcome to Caspion Report. One of the biggest international fears is that once Iran gets a nuclear weapon, it triggers a nuclear arms race involving Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey. This is a very likely scenario, and it is exactly what the nuclear talks aim to prevent. The main component of the framework agreement is that it extends Iran's breakout capacity. A lot of people, and this includes politicians and analysts, misunderstand or misuse the meaning of breakout capacity. And officially, it's not even part of the nuclear negotiations. But what it means is the time a country requires to produce enough highly enriched uranium for one nuclear weapon. This can be measured in weeks, months, years, decades, and much more. All of the agreed upon points focus on extending the breakout capacity, because the longer it would take Iran to produce a nuclear weapon, the longer the other Middle Eastern nations such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey can be persuaded to abstain from a nuclear arms race. Think about it this way: a breakout capacity of 1 year is less urgent than 1 week, and thus countries are more willing to diplomatically solve issues rather than a dangerous arms race. To this end, the framework agreement will reduce Iran's installed enrichment centrifuges from 19,000 to 6,000, of which only 5,000 will actually be spinning. All of the centrifuges will be of first generation, and Iran will not be allowed to use more advanced models for at least 10 years. And any new developed model will have to be first submitted to the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA for short. Furthermore, only the main enrichment facility at Natanz will be allowed to carry out uranium enrichment. Iran's second facility at Fordow, which is buried deep within a mountain complex and thought to be impregnable to conventional airstrikes, will be converted into a physics research center, and it will not produce or stockpile highly enriched uranium for at least 15 years. Iran's current low-enriched uranium stockpile will be reduced from 10,000 kilos to 300 kilos for the next 15 years. Russia will receive the current Iranian stockpiles and reprocess them. Furthermore, the heavy water reactor in Iraq will be redesigned at its core so that no plutonium is produced at the site. Also, no other heavy water reactor will be allowed to be constructed for another 15 years. And finally, all 3 sites at Natanz, Fordow, and Iraq will come under heavy inspection by the IAEA. These points, important as they are not without their problems. First off, all the agreed points depend on the goodwill of Iran. So if Tehran feels like cheating, they can do so. In fact, Tehran did falsify and hide documents, events, and locations in the past. For example, the facilities at Natanz and Fordow were only acknowledged after overwhelming evidence by the CIA and Mossad. The second point is that there is no real disciplinary mechanism. The US talks about imposing crippling sanctions on Iran, so in theory, the sanctions would force the leadership in Tehran to change policy, and the only significant way to impose sanctions is by blocking Iran's import of gasoline. The thing is that Iran, despite sitting on some of the world's largest reserves, imports at least 35% of the gasoline it consumes. So blocking Iran from gasoline imports would certainly be dangerous for Iran. Anything less than this would be mere symbolical and for PR purposes, as is the case with most sanctions. The problem with this plan is that the US expects China and Russia to participate in the sanctions. For one, China gets 11% of its oil from Iran, and has in fact publicly stated that Beijing will continue to deliver gasoline to Iran. As for Russia, Moscow itself is under sanctions by the US. There is no reason for the Russians to participate in an American-led sanctions against Iran that could solve a major issue for the US. The Russians are in no mood to do the Americans a favor. Without the participation of Russia and China in the potential sanctions against Iran, the sanctions will not work. So this whole plan comes down to the goodwill of Iran, and with no way to enforce sanctions as disciplinary mechanism. The only other form of punishment is the military option, which has its own risks. And if this wasn't enough to derail the agreement, there is major domestic opposition to the US-Iran deal in Washington and in Tehran. A large portion of the American Congress opposes the idea of a deal with Iran that does nothing to address the geopolitics of the Middle East. There are also many business interests at play. Many of the American top companies, especially in the military complex, have prospered from the conventional arms sales between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Similar business interests exist in Tehran. Due to the sanctions, a lot of people in the Iranian elite and governmental circles have made a fortune by creating monopolies throughout the country. This is especially true for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is an autonomous military, political, economic institution. Obviously, these oligarchs don't want Iran to return to the global economy, as it would devastate their business interests. And since the Iranian Revolutionary Guard controls many of the weaponized dimensions of the nuclear program, they could easily sabotage the whole deal. So there is significant domestic opposition in Washington and in Tehran. But there are also third parties that oppose any kind of deal between the US and Iran. One example is Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister. Netanyahu's opposition to the framework agreement is domestic related, not security or geopolitics, as most Israeli geopoliticians and security analysts would attest to. Fear-mongering is critical to attain popular support for right parties, and that is what Netanyahu is aiming for. The only genuine concern for Israel is to extend the breakout capacity to at least 1 year, and for the whole Iranian nuclear program to become more transparent. Another example of a third-party opposition in the nuclear agreement is Saudi Arabia. Former King Abdullah maintained that the Iranian nuclear program was related to the geopolitics of the Middle East. His successor, King Salman, continues on that policy, and in this regard, the Saudi monarchy and a portion of the American Congress agree. The Iranian role in the current geopolitical affairs must be addressed in conjunction with the nuclear talks. But connecting the nuclear talks with the geopolitics of the region will ensure the failure of the nuclear talks, and that is exactly what Riyadh wants, to break up the American-Iranian talks and to get the United States on the Saudi side of the ongoing Saudi-Iranian Cold War. At its core, if implemented, the framework agreement prevents a dangerous nuclear arms race involving Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Turkey. And despite all the complaints and all the opposition to the American-Iranian deal, nobody has yet to offer a realistic alternative. This was a Caspian Report by me, Shirvan. Thank you for watching, take care, and sagal.